Welcome to the show with me, your host, Arvid Viana. And in this episode, we take a closer look at carbon offsets, how they work, how they've evolved, and what the evidence tells us about their effectiveness. And we focus on a recent study by Dr. Ben Probst and his co-authors, who analyzed over 1 billion carbon credits across different project types, raising important questions about which credits actually reduce emissions and which might not. And after this episode, you'll be better equipped to ask sharper and more informed questions about how carbon offsets fit into climate policy, as well as their effectiveness. So Dr. Ben Probst is an environmental economist and the head of the Net Zero Lab at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich. His research focuses on accelerating climate technologies, and he's also affiliated with the Cambridge University and ETH Zurich. Ben holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and has worked with organizations like the World Bank and the German Development Bank. So, Ben, welcome to the podcast.
All right, thanks for having me.
I am very excited about our conversation. And for the listeners, I came across a post that you made on LinkedIn about your research on carbon credit offsets. Could you just give a quick explanation of what these carbon credit offsets are and why they are used?
Yeah, so carbon credits are typically generated by voluntary project initiatives. These could be reduced emissions from deforestation in the Amazon or fuel-efficient cookstoves in Kenya. And these projects reduce emissions, and then they produce certificates, which essentially just say this certificate makes sure that 1 ton of CO2 was reduced or removed from the atmosphere, and then others use it often to offset their emissions or part of their emissions. So a car company in Europe could say, well, we buy several tons or many so sort of thousands of tons of carbon credits from certain projects to make this one model that we sell carbon neutral. There are a lot of problems about these claims, but this is sort of the basic setup. You pay someone else to reduce or remove emissions, and then you make claims that you've essentially done it because you've paid that person or that project.
So it's both reductions and then also maybe the avoidance of future emissions. So both can be included in these.
That's right. So the reduction is really you have a pollution stream and you're reducing that. Avoidance is often more hypothetical. You think that a certain land would be chopped down, and so you save it. But yeah, we're already getting into the complexities of this sector. But yeah, there's avoidance, there's removal, and there's also reduction. And the removal part is really drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere.
Got it. And then what got you interested in the topic of studying these carbon credits?
So I've been interested in a range of topics around carbon credits. So my first paper was on really trying to understand how effective deforestation policies are within the Brazilian Amazon. And turns out this is one of the bigger project categories within carbon offset markets, is reducing deforestation. I was also quite interested in renewable energy and how you can actually deploy it at scale globally. Another big project category are renewable energy offsets. And then these interests came together as I saw that quite a lot of companies were making carbon neutrality claims. So whenever you walk into a supermarket, you can see a range of products claiming that they're carbon neutral. And so I was really curious to understand what's behind that. And so I started looking deeper into the literature, and it became quite clear that many claims didn't hold what they were, claiming to do.
Before we dive into your paper, I just want to briefly touch on the broader context, because carbon credits were first introduced under the Kyoto Protocol and then later evolved under the Paris Agreement, which created a new framework for these international carbon markets. Could you give an idea of the size of this carbon credit market and what you cover in your study?
Yeah, so it's roughly 5 gigatons, so 5 billion, and we cover around 1 billion ton of credits. So it's quite a large market. And perhaps to briefly explain the history, you've already alluded to it. So it actually emanated in sort of as a voluntary approach. You had this American company, AER, an energy company, and they were building a new power plant. And the CEO came to one of the employees and said, well, I think climate change could be real. Remember this the 80s, and said, how could we compensate these emissions? So they toyed around with a lot of ideas, capturing the carbon and using it to make fizzy drinks. Then they realized they have far too much carbon to actually fill all the bottles that they needed to. They thought about putting it at the bottom of the ocean, the captured CO2. And then someone came up with the idea of planting forests, because forests suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so they wanted to do it close to the plant, but then they realized they don't have the space to do it. So they did it in South America. And so the first carbon offset project was born. Turned out that the project itself only captured a fraction of what it intended to capture, which already shows sort of a few of the basic problems. But the original idea was very new then. And so it got picked up later within the Kyoto Protocol, which had two flexibility mechanisms. They were called the Clean Development Mechanism and Joint Implementation, which essentially meant that for those countries that didn't have binding climate targets, they could still do climate mitigation and then sell these credits to countries that actually had a binding climate target. So Germany could buy credits from the global south and count it towards its own emission reductions. That's the basic setup. And that has essentially now been in place since the early 2000s, the CDM and joint implementation. And as you said, now under the Paris Agreement, we have essentially a similar mechanism to the Clean Development Mechanism. Now it's a bit different because essentially everyone has a target, they're voluntary targets, but these credits are supposed to help countries achieve an even more ambitious version of their climate target, and that can then be sold to other countries.
Could you maybe also talk about who organizes the carbon credit offset markets? Because it's kind of like a mix, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are three different layers, and it gets complex very fast. But the first one is really the private market, which is often called the voluntary carbon market, which is essentially it's typically private project developers who sell carbon credits to other buyers, companies, for instance. Then you have what's called the quasi-compliance markets. These are markets that are often organized by international organizations. So the CDM, for instance, is organized by the United Nations. And there you often have buyers from the public sphere, so countries. But then the credits from these two first markets, the private market and this quasi-compliance market, they can end up in compliance schemes like the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which bought quite a lot of these credits from the Clean Development Mechanism. So in total, around 1 billion tons from the CDM and joint implementation ended up within Europe's domestic scheme. So they often originate within the private market or this quasi-compliance market, but then they get even bought by these compliance schemes, as in Europe in the emissions trading scheme. So you have a range of different layers, essentially, and different organizations that are engaged in these markets.
Exactly. And so which then makes sense that you would want them in the compliance markets, because the carbon price is now at 80, 100 euros. It's quite high if you want to, emit one more ton of CO2. So if you can get it from some other market and get certified, then that's a very attractive proposition.
Yeah.
To include them, because for a while they were excluded, I think, from the EU ETS just completely, or was it just some parts of it?
So they were included at the beginning, but then around 2013, they really limited the eligibility of carbon credits from international projects, mainly due to quality concerns. And it was really depressing the market price within the EU ETS. But generally, the idea is that these credits are much cheaper. So it's quite efficient in theory to use credits. You're essentially doing emission reductions where it's cheapest globally. But I think many people have not considered that in many places in the global south, the institutions are often weak. And so it's really hard to make sure that these projects deliver what they claim to do. And we can get into the specific problems. But what seems very cheap on paper doesn't often deliver what it claims to have achieved. And so when the EU ETS really reduced its intake of these credits, the prices within the clean development mechanism collapsed. And so a lot of projects were canceled in the wake of that.
Which makes sense because then the EU ETS was just a high driver of demand for these projects. I think that's useful history also for me to kind of interpret some of your results. And then maybe we can then just get into some of the results of your paper, because then could you maybe then just describe what you set out to do in your paper and how you went about it? Because I think it's a very interesting exercise that you did.
Yeah, so this is a paper where we got together many of the leading scholars within the carbon credit field. So I didn't do this alone. We did this in a team of 11 scholars globally. So we have people in the States, but also in Europe and other places. And the general idea was to really bring together all the evidence we have on the effectiveness of carbon credits and try to synthesize the results. So to give you a bit of backstory, there were a number of different papers looking at different project types. So there were studies looking at avoided deforestation. There were others looking at cookstoves. Then you had studies looking at renewable energy, and they were all quite disparate literatures. And so what we tried to do is bring them together and find one metric to make them comparable, and just say, well, this is what we know within the academic literature on this topic. Because what's often been said is, well, look, I mean, this is just one study looking at a few projects. I mean, what can we really learn from that? And so what we wanted to do is say, no, that's not correct. There are a lot of studies showing very similar things. And so we looked essentially at every study that we could find that had sort of a credible control group and bring them together and synthesize the results.
Yeah, so one of the contributions, as I'm hearing it, is instead of like looking at one or two areas or one or two studies, you just looked at synthesizing all the evidence out there so you could address the claim that is just, oh, this isn't representative.
Exactly.
And then how did you go about this? Because I feel like it was quite a framework that you used to systematically use the studies that you used. Could you discuss this more?
Yeah. So we started with keywords to identify the relevant studies, but it turns out that gave us around 60,000 potentially relevant studies.
And 60,000 is a lot.
Yeah, it would have been hard to screen manually. So we used AS Review, which is essentially a machine learning prioritization tool. So you train the model on relevant abstracts, and so it gives you similar studies. And so you essentially don't screen 60,000 studies, but perhaps 10,000 studies. And so this is still a lot, but it's much easier to do it that way. And then once we had that study, the studies, we used the so-called PICO framework. I mean, you do this at the beginning, but this PICO framework essentially is you think about what's your population, what's your intervention, what's your comparator, and what is your outcome. So the population we were interested in were essentially all carbon crediting projects that had been done and for which we could find literature. And that's also the intervention. So in our case, that's the same. Then you want a comparator, which essentially means if you're trying to protect forest, you're not just looking at the protected area, but you're also creating a credible counterfactual area that was not protected by the forest. Because it could be that you're protecting some forest, but for reasons other than your project intervention, deforestation goes down. For instance, there's a new environmental law that reduces deforestation, or demand for beef goes down. And so it's important to have these comparators. And then you essentially look at the outcome. And the outcome for us was how much CO2 was saved by the project. And that's important because a lot of these studies have different outcome variables. Some look at avoided deforestation in hectares, others look at it in terms of CO2. And so what we were trying to do is find a metric to compare them all. And so we tried to really figure out what the reduced CO2 was by these projects compared to a credible control group. And then we compared that number to what had been issued in terms of carbon credits. And we call that the offset achievement ratio, which just means if you had issued 100 credits and you just achieved 50 of them, then that would be an offset achievement ratio of 50%. And so that gave us one number to compare all these different project categories to each other.
Exactly. If it's 100%, it just means like everything you promised has actually been achieved.
Mm-hmm.
If it's 0, it means you had no success whatsoever.
Exactly.
Like you promised 100 units, but actually nothing happened.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it could, in theory, it could also be 150. So you're overachieving. And we see some projects where that happened, but the majority didn't achieve what they'd claimed that they would.
Yeah. So do you want to then maybe just give the general, like the headline numbers
Mm-hmm.
of the paper? Because I think we can then dive into some of these in more detail, because I think it's really interesting to show the details, but it makes sense, I think, to start with the overall number.
Yeah, so we looked at around 1 billion tons of carbon credits that had been issued, and what we find is that less than 16% of these carbon credits constitute real emission reductions. So less than 16%. It could be lower than that 16% because we couldn't even look at all the different reasons why these numbers might be inflated. But just looking at the criteria that we could identify, we estimate it's less than 16%. And then we find different offset achievement ratios for different sectors. So the sector with the highest achievement ratio in our analysis is HFC 23 abatement. That's a chemical, essentially a byproduct in the chemical industry. And if you try to reduce that, that has which has quite a potent climate effect. There's often not a business case for it, and so they have quite high achievement ratios. Then for avoided deforestation, which is quite a prominent project category, was around 25%, we estimate. And then if you take Cookstoves, we estimate it's around 11%. But what I should say, it's only for projects that were covered within the literature that we can make this claim for. There might be many other projects within that project categories that this number doesn't apply to. So we can only make this claim for the projects we have good evidence for.
I do think one of the impressive points is the coverage you said is 1 billion. And like you said, there's about 5 billion of these credits. Mm-hmm. So you've covered 20% of all issued credits, mm-hmm. which I think is a substantial amount. Then maybe we can dive into some of these in more detail, because mm-hmm. I think showing people some of this could illustrate some of the challenges. I think so. The biggest ones in terms of overall credits issued were renewables. Mm-hmm. I think in the overall joint space of the clean development mechanism, with especially wind. Could you then maybe talk about that category and what went on there?
Yeah, so within the clean development mechanism, there was a push to develop wind energy, which of course in itself is a very noble goal and important to pursue. But the basic theory of change is that with the sale of carbon credits, you make a project financially viable. So let's say you want to build a wind power plant in India, and within the existing power market, you sell power to the grid. You can't make it work. It's just not financially viable. And so the theory is, with the top up you get from selling carbon credits, you go to the bank and say, look, we got now, we think we can sell the following amount of carbon credits at a certain price, and now it becomes financially viable. It's called additionality. So you're making additional projects viable via the sale of carbon credits. After my PhD, I worked a bit in renewable energy finance, and from experience, I can tell you this is bogus. There might be cases where this worked, but no bank, or at least to my knowledge, no bank will say, okay, you have volatile prices with this new technology. You have no idea how many carbon credits you will be able to sell. And because of this very questionable promise, we now give you millions of dollars. That's probably not going to happen. So what a lot of studies, or what these two studies that we have in the review show, is that many of these projects were financially viable even without carbon credits. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, because I mean, it was probably nice to get some additional revenue from carbon credits, or potential revenue, but you had no idea where the carbon price would go. And for the CDM, it crashed very, very quickly. And some people might have expected that. And the carbon prices were quite low, which means you have low revenues and very volatile prices, which, if you run a financial model as a bank, should not make a huge difference to your financing decision. And so within the studies we find no statistically significant effect on additional renewable energy plants or wind power plants being built, at least for the CDM projects within China and India.
As I understand it, one of the key features in this subset is the high capital requirements to build these, wind turbines. The one thing I didn't see was solar, because I imagine solar is less capital intensive. Is there something there that, because solar is less capital intensive, there could be a higher additionality?
So solar and wind, if you think about sort of the time frame, that's late 2000s, early 2010s. There's solar and wind both were quite expensive. And if you compare renewable energy technologies to, let's say, fossil fuel based alternatives, they have very high upfront costs, because once you run them, the inputs, or the OPEX, are essentially zero. You have a bit of maintenance, but if you have a gas-fired power plant, you need a lot of fuel to actually run the plant. So all of the financing needs to come essentially at the beginning. And so they're both, solar and wind and renewable energy more generally are quite capital intensive. And so I think for both of these project categories, it's very unlikely that this would have made a big difference, in my view.
I saw that you mentioned in your paper wind was taken out of most of these carbon crediting mechanisms because, like you say, like it was recognized to some extent that there's no additionality. You're not actually, like, these would have otherwise happened anyway. But then some of them I did see bring them back in, which presents an interesting puzzle that they would then, bring them back in. So
yeah, perhaps one point on this. So I think it's quite instructive to look at what actually led to the deployment of renewable energy. So take Germany, for instance, one of the biggest markets for solar in the 2000s. And what really drove the deployment there were feed-in tariffs, which essentially meant you have a high price guaranteed for your deployment for a fixed amount of time, typically 20 years. And that led to a lot of deployment. Now, carbon credits are exactly the opposite. They're not fixed prices, they're extremely volatile prices, and they're not, over a long time frame, which you can calculate with, but it probably varies quite a lot over time. And so on both dimensions, carbon credits are much less attractive than the feed-in tariffs, which led to a lot of deployment of renewable energy. And I think that's just important to think through why perhaps the additionality of these projects wasn't that high. And perhaps one other thing, we say in the paper that we didn't find, statistically significant effects. There might be effects, but they're so small that we can't really see them. And so we don't know whether it's zero, but it's probably somewhere around that.
then maybe we can move on to this forest management, which then happened in the United States mostly, as I read it. Could you then maybe speak to that?
So yeah, improved forest management is another big project category, mainly in the United States. And so we looked at credits that were issued under the California Air Resources Board's U.S. Forest Project Protocol. And so essentially, what these projects are trying to do is that they reduce forest degradation. And again, that in itself is a very worthy goal. We're losing a lot of forest, and that leads to additional emissions, biodiversity loss, and of course also the loss of income for communities. But as so often, it depends a lot on the design of the specific protocol and methodology. And so the problem with this methodology, as studies show, it was essentially adverse selection. So to calculate what these forests had saved in terms of CO2, they used a very coarse baseline. So essentially, the average in this region, in terms of what these forests had in terms of carbon, sort of stored in the trees. And what then happened was that forest plots or projects self-selected into the system that already had higher rates of carbon essentially saved in these forests. And so let's say the average is 100, but you have 120 in your forest, you're getting credited this 20 without doing anything. And so these credits are being issued without any sort of additional forest protection because of the design of the system. And so that's another project category where within the existing literature, we couldn't find any evidence that this project category saved any forest, despite being the largest source of credits within California. And so that is mainly adverse selection. So for wind, it was really a problem of additionality. Here, it's more a problem of adverse selection.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's just an average calculated for forests in general, but then the forests who benefit the most just self-select into the program, getting like credited these reductions that might not actually happen. Could you then maybe talk about the Cookstoves next and what you found there?
Yeah, so for Cookstoves, the basic idea is that a lot of people, especially in the global south, still use biomass for cooking. And with fuel efficient cookstoves, you can essentially kill two birds with one stone. So you reduce emissions from burning biomass by having more fuel efficient stoves, and it also reduces indoor air pollution, which is a huge health hazard. And that's really important. It's just quite tricky in the real world to measure the reduction of these different cookstove projects. And so what's been found are, I'd say, two main problems. The first one is a methodological problem. So to calculate the emissions that have been saved through burning less biomass, you have to calculate what's called or determine the fraction of non-renewable sources of fuel wood and other biomass. And if you assume that only a low fraction of biomass will naturally regrow, you're saving essentially quite a lot of carbon. But if the biomass regrows, then after some time, even if you use that biomass to cook, it will sort of reabsorb the emissions. And so what a lot of projects do is that they use very unrealistic levels of this fraction of non-renewable sources of fuel wood to make these calculations. And so what studies do within the space is essentially they use more realistic parameters to calculate it and readjust the expected emission reductions, which are much lower than what projects claim. And then the second problem is that often it's quite unclear how people use these cook stoves. So what some studies find in this space is that people use not just a fuel efficient cook stove, but also the original stove. So they might actually be burning more biomass because now they have two stoves that they have to use for cooking. And so there might be some suppressed demand that then essentially comes to the fore. And so methodologies that are being used to calculate the reductions are of different quality. There's a very good paper by Wiel et al. From Berkeley, and what they essentially do is they recalculate these emission reductions based on more credible estimates of these parameters, and overall that around only 11% of what's been claimed constitute real emission reductions. And so, which means that also all the health effects that we would expect from lower biomass usage in cooking also wouldn't materialize, because if you can't get the carbon benefits, you're likely also not getting the health benefits. And just to flag, there might be specific choices that the authors made in recalculating. They base it on the literature. You might recalculate it slightly differently and get to slightly different results. But I think the overall assessment is correct. It's somewhere in this range, probably.
That's maybe the thing I didn't fully get is this 11% that they recalculate is relative to the 100% calculated by the organization or whatever methodology was used.
Yeah.
So it's not going from 50 to 11. It's actually this 11 versus the 100%.
That's correct.
Okay, then maybe we can do one more, which I thought was really interesting because it's the most effective one, which you find in your study, which was these more chemical gases. Could you maybe talk to them and what could be driving that result, or what's the story there?
Yeah, so we looked at two different chemicals, so HFC-23 and SF6, which are both quite potent climate gases. And so destroying them makes a lot of sense. In a lot of countries, there's no regulation to abate these gases, so they're essentially just vented to the atmosphere. And destroying them has huge climate benefits. And so within the CDM and the joint implementation, there were a range of projects. And just to pick perhaps HFC-23, so these were projects within the CDM where HFC-23 was destroyed. And as I said, as there's typically no business case to do it or local regulation, abating these chemicals is really important. But there's one catch to that, which is what we saw in the studies who analyzed these projects, was that some of the plants actually increased the production of these waste gases because they could then essentially sell more credits. And that still leads to a reduction of emissions, because after abating them, you're still emitting some CO2, but it's definitely less than sort of the original pollutant. But this perverse incentive to produce more waste gases is something that methodologies and program administrators have to be quite mindful of. And so the methodologies were then updated, but most plants never applied these methodologies.
Yeah, so it's almost before the measurements start, they ramp up their production. So they have this kind of higher baseline to start from,
right?
And then they claim the reduction of all of these to get back to whatever level they were, or even a little bit lower.
Yeah.
Is that so? Like the reduction itself is very efficient, but there's the potential that they were just ramping up their production before it starts.
That's right.
So not ideal if you want to,
Yeah, it's quite a depressing picture on the one hand. At the same time, what I should also say is that, of course, there are projects that are achieving what they claim that they have achieved. They're a minority, but within our sample, we see that some projects can achieve the promised reductions, but overall, just a fraction of the sold credits constitute real emission reductions. And of course, that is a huge problem for mitigating climate change.
Yeah, there's an incentive to do this, but like you say, some firms probably just actually do it, like properly, and then you get these actual reductions, which is the goal after all. Then maybe taking a step back. So you've done this paper, and now we're now July, and the European Commission has now just kind of proposed their new regulations, whereby the new topical thing is that they included a provision in their proposal that there's 3% of reductions going forward to 2040 would be feasible with these carbon credit offsets. And I think you've spoken to this, that there might be some caution to be applied there. Could you just speak to that, or know what your opinion is on these new proposals?
Yeah, so to flag perhaps two important things at the beginning. So what they're proposing is using international carbon credits. So from the projects or project categories that we have discussed and others. And they're going against the scientific advice of their own scientific advisory board, which has cautioned against using these credits to achieve the 240 emission reduction target. That's one. And they're going against their own climate law passed in 21, which suggested or said that the credits that can be used towards the target can only come from domestic sources. And so they're essentially now backtracking these commitments and the advice from their best science advisors. And so that just sort of as a disclaimer. And 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but actually in 2040, that's around 145 million tons. And cumulatively from 2036 to 2050, around 1 billion tons. So we're talking about huge volumes of credits that could be used within Europe and to achieve the NDCs. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done before we have enough confidence that the credits that come from international sources are actually trustworthy enough to be used towards these climate targets. And within the EU ETS, for instance, we discussed this before. CDM credits at some point became extremely sort of restricted because there were such doubts about the integrity of these credits. And now the Commission says, well, we just want high integrity credits, but at least to my mind, there hasn't been a fundamental revamping of the system itself. So I don't see why this new why now it should be fundamentally different. Yes, there have been some improvements, but I don't think we're at a point yet where we should be pursuing international credits. But we still have some way to go. So these credits proposed by the Commission would be used from 2036 onwards. So we have 11 years to improve the system and perhaps make it ready if the 3% rule comes to pass.
All right, thank you for that. I think that's also, a very good disclaimer observation towards the future. Is there anything you would like to add to what we've discussed, or results-wise, policy-wise, that we might have missed, or that you feel like could use some more emphasis?
Yeah, so briefly about the new crediting mechanism. So the new system, which is essentially coming after the Clean Development Mechanism, is called the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, PACM. And there are some bright spots and there's some room for improvement, let's put it that way. So what's been quite promising within the system is that now we have two different markets essentially that are evolving. We have an international market called Article 6.4. And so you have a range of countries that might be trading carbon credits. And there, the standards that we've seen so far are quite ambitious. So they're much better than the CDM standards that we've seen before. So that is quite a promising development. But now there are two problems. One is that there will be projects that transition from the Clean Development Mechanism to this new mechanism. And the first projects we've seen have quite substantial quality problems. And so that could actually be a problem for this new market that has quite high standards. But with all this legacy that's problematic, this might dampen the market outlook for some time. And then there's also Article 6.2, which are so-called decentralized cooperative approaches, which are just these projects between countries. And there's no global oversight. There's not one big standard as in Article 6.4. And so within 6.2, we will probably see quite a lot of variance when it comes to the quality of the methodologies, the oversight, because that will be determined between the two countries trading the credits. So for instance, Switzerland and Ghana. And what we've seen so far is that there's not a lot of transparency and it's quite hard to assess how good these are. So I'm quite hopeful about Article 6.4, but I'm a bit more pessimistic about 6.2, but this is to be seen how good this is. So all to say, with this new development, we might see some improvements, but we have to be quite watchful and quite quite focused on the details of especially the bilateral approaches.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that's actually really helpful to actually know going forward. And Article 6.4 sounds promising, like you say, in terms of the direction and the standard. So, and then, future research is needed, as they sometimes say. So,
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate you taking the time. I learned a lot. And I think, as you said, one thing I take away is also like this can be promising, but there's more rigor needed to ensure that we're getting what sometimes it's being promised. So,
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Arvid, for having me.
That's it for this episode. Thank you very much for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation, feel free to subscribe, share it with a friend, or check the show notes for more information. You can contact me on arvid.viana.ce@gmail.com. That is also in the show notes. And I will see you in another episode. Have a great day.